Three major questions need to be answered in economics. How will goods be produced? The answer is some combination of the factors of production available to the economy. And particularly on a microeconomic level, the question is answered in a market-based capitalist economy by the entrepreneur of every firm organized in that economy. Next question, which goods and services will be produced, is best visualized graphically by what we call a production possibilities curve. The production possibilities curve shows the different combinations of goods and services an economy can produce. To keep it simple, it usually shows only two different goods and services, both of which we assume share some factors of production. In reality, there are usually numerous goods and services that could be made by most economies' factors of production. The production possibilities curve has the amount of units of a good or service that could be produced on the y-axis, and the amount of units of an opposing good or service on the x-axis. The curve is a line that graphically shows how much of a good or service on either axis could be produced if a level of the opposing good or service were produced. So for example, were an economy to make a production decision represented graphically by point A, it could produce 200 skis and no snowboards. If it decided on B instead, it would choose instead to produce 100 skis and 50 snowboards. The slope of the curve tells a big story. This economy needs to sacrifice its production of 2 skis for every snowboard it decides to produce. These goods and services could be easily replaced with anything else, by the way. Maybe New York City could choose to hire 100 school nurses in the next fiscal year only if it also chose to hire no new NYPD officers. An alternative for the city might be to hire no new school nurses and instead hire 72 police officers. Even another alternative may be to hire 50 school nurses and 36 cops. The principle remains the same. Because the factors of production are similar, there's a trade-off. Producing one level of service, say school-based healthcare for students K through 12, requires sacrifices of another level of service, like emergency call response times. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about the production possibilities curve for a single factory, a company, a city, or a country. As long as you're talking about goods or services with shared factors of production, the graph is communicating the same message. A visual representation of the possible choices that could be made and the sacrifice or opportunity cost of every decision. Opportunity costs are important because they can give us crucial insight into whether an economy has any comparative advantages. Comparative advantages exist when an economy has a lower opportunity cost for producing a good or service compared to another economy. In our nurses example, the slope of our production possibilities curve would be roughly negative 1.39 school nurses per police officer. And in other words, every NYPD officer we hired would cost the city 1.39 nurses, where every 3 cops hired would cost the city about 4 nurses. If in Los Angeles the same production possibilities curve had a slope of, say, negative 1.15 school nurses per police officer, then we'd say LA had a comparative advantage in providing police officer services. That's because LA has to sacrifice hiring fewer nurses for every LAPD officer it hires compared to the NYC. On a more microeconomic level, using this Alpine sports example, we can see that the company's 3 firms have different opportunity costs for producing snowboards, and therefore some have a comparative advantage to others. Plant 3 is the best at producing snowboards because it can get away with doing so while sacrificing far fewer skis compared to Plant 1 or even Plant 2. You can tell graphically that this is the case because Plant 3's curve is flatter than Plant 1, whose curve is steeper than Plant 2's. Why does any of this matter? Well, imagine Alpine Sports had all 3 plants dedicated to making only skis, producing a total of 350 of them a month. But suddenly the firm realized there was a real opportunity in making snowboards and wanted to enter that market. All of Alpine's plants have the same total snowboard making capacity. Each can make 100 snowboards at full production. But the entrepreneur is probably interested in transitioning into the snowboard market with the least disruptions and cost to its core business of ski production. So the first 100 snowboards it makes should probably be made at the plant that can make them while sacrificing the fewest skis, only 50. And so on until the factory with the highest opportunity cost for making snowboards is the last to be activated. Transitioning the plants from skis to snowboards in this fashion ensures that production is maximized. You only need to draw the slope of each curve in the opposite order to realize that it would be bowed in instead of bowed out. A graphical representation of how alpine sports would be operating inefficiently under its production capacity if it started its venture into snowboard production with Plan 1 instead of Plan 3. Producing inefficiently could be an undesired outcome from one of the two major problems. Perhaps factors of production are idle and not being used to their fullest potential. This would mean the economy hasn't achieved full employment, a concept you'll learn more about in macroeconomics. But for a firm, in a microeconomic concept, full employment would be the same as being able to operate its factors at full capacity, with full staffing. Anything less would create a production possibilities curve with a slope underneath the full employment scenario. The other major problem may arise even with full employment if alpine sports enters the snowboard market with the wrong plants leading the way. If its most proficient factories are activated last, alpine sports would produce a lot less skis at first, translating to a larger drop in sales activity than would have occurred if comparative advantage determined which factories led the transition. Selling 100 snowboards is a lot more profitable if you only had to stop selling 50 skis versus 200. Now's the perfect time to discuss the law of increasing opportunity costs. Most activities abide by this law. At first, every resource dedicated to a new activity, whether that be producing a good or service, or learning a new skill or sport, bears more fruit earlier on than it will as you progress in that activity. Consider that the first hour you ever spent learning how to ride a bike probably gave you a lot more progress toward fully utilizing bikes than the next hour. And certainly as a pro off-road biker, every hour of practice you spend will only take you so far in better utilizing your bike. Progress is easier to make when we're first doing something, and usually requires us to sacrifice more, the increasing opportunity costs, to make the same amount of progress the further along we get in the activity. Experts can spend years trying to make the same amount of quantifiable progress they made during their first years as a novice in their field. Similarly, alpine sports will need to sacrifice a lot more skis the deeper it wants to get into the snowboard market. Each new snowboard will cost more skis than the one before it, as factories with less proficiency at making snowboards are recruited. The law of increasing opportunity costs in action. So the production possibilities curve for an economy isn't really a linear slope, but more like a bowed out curve indicating that as the economy makes choices in one direction or another, its opportunity costs will increase the closer it gets to either axis. The production possibilities model, with its law of increasing opportunity costs, implies that economies will begin specializing. This makes sense whether you're talking about people or nations. Since activities generally abide by the law of increasing opportunity costs, it doesn't make sense for you to try to become a police officer and an experienced Michelin star chef. What's more likely is that you'll choose the activity you have a comparative advantage in, like learning criminal justice and law enforcement, and visit the restaurant of someone who made the choice to become a Michelin star chef. That's specialization in a nutshell. On a more macroeconomic level, nations do the same thing, using decisions on specializations and trade to shape their economic growth. More on that next.